Sun Tzu famously said, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." But in today's high-stakes tensions between America, China, and Russia, what if the ultimate battlefield isn't military, it's economic? Today's guest, Edward Fishman, former lead in the State Department, reveals the unspoken methods of the U.S. economic warfare machine, including the risk and reward of weaponized tariffs, the hidden ripple effects of sanctions, and how you can topple a government without firing a single shot. As China threatens to fight America in whatever kind of war it wants, and tensions continue to rise in the Russia-Ukraine war, this is an episode you do not want to miss. Let me ask, is Trump making a strategic error by putting tariff on friend and foe alike?
I do think he is. Tariffs can be a useful tool, right? I think for too long, the U.S. has not protected strategic industries from competition from countries like China. China has become the dominant player in things like electric vehicles. And the most recent administration put 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. I thought that was a smart move because what are you going to do if every single electric vehicle on the road is made in China? Not only is that bad for U.S. car companies, but in the event that we're in a conflict with China, what are we going to do, right? They can stop selling cars to us. So I think tariffs have a place. The thing I'm a little worried about, though, when it comes to tariffs on friends like Canada and Mexico, is that if you do this, companies can't make investments anywhere, really, that they feel confident about besides being in the United States. You basically move towards something that looks like autarky when everything is made domestically. From an economic standpoint, that leads to higher prices, slower economic growth. But actually, the thing that worries me more is if you look at history, when states can't acquire markets and resources through open trade, the temptation to conquer or go to war with other countries goes up quite a bit. It's one thing to impose tariffs or sanctions on an adversary like China, which is something I'm very much in favor of. But then when you start wielding these weapons against Canada, Mexico, the EU, Brazil, everyone sort of starts hedging and no one really feels confident that you can have a long-term relationship with the United States.
How do you create a situation where the U.S. isn't vulnerable to China cutting them off, not just from electric cars, but from medication, chips, whatever the case, all the things that give us our modern way of life, so much is manufactured in China, without tariffing to incentivize people to manufacture in the US? It feels like we went so far in the other direction in the globalist period that we really did put ourselves at pretty high risk.
The reason is that the global economy we live in is still designed for the benign geopolitical environment of the 1990s, the halcyon days of the 90s. But we have intense geopolitical competition between the US and China principally, but also Russia, Iran, and other countries. So I think you're right. I think we need to incentivize domestic manufacturing of strategic goods, things like automobiles, like technologies, like semiconductors, right? And I think that's why the CHIPS Act was a smart move, right? You're putting in $50 billion to incentivize the production of semiconductors here at home instead of relying on countries like Taiwan, right? The thing that I worry about is tariffs against everybody, because you can't go toward 100% domestic production in your supply chain. It's just not how the economy works. So what I would support would be higher tariffs on countries like China, where we have really significant trade deficits, and we're really worried about China weaponizing things like critical minerals against the United States. The reason I called my book Choke Points are these are areas of the global economy where one country has a dominant position and there's very little redundancy. There are a lot of these choke points that China controls. So I think taking proactive steps to reduce our vulnerabilities is essential. Whether we should be doing that against Canada, where we actually have balanced trade, doesn't really add up or make sense to me.
Why do you think Trump is doing it? And what do you think is going to be the knock-on effect?
It's a good question. He's doing it actually under a 1977 law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This law is specifically for national security uses. So if you look at what Trump is saying about the Canada and Mexico tariffs, as well as the actual legal authorities that are being used for them, it's all about this idea of fentanyl and migrants coming into the United States. He's basically trying to use the tariffs as a cudgel to force the Canadian and Mexican governments to take the migrant and fentanyl issue more seriously. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, that's how you use things like sanctions or tariffs to a certain extent. A 25% tariff on Canada, I think, is out of step with the degree of the fentanyl issue coming from Canada. I think last year there was a couple dozen kilograms of fentanyl seized at the US-Canadian border. So it's not a massive problem on the northern border. With Mexico, it's a bigger problem. And I think there's a fair question whether or not that we should be applying pressure to the Mexican government, and I support that. The challenge with tariffs is that most American production industries, like the car industry, are heavily dependent on inputs from places like Canada and Mexico. And frankly, this is largely because of the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or the USMCA, which Trump negotiated during his first term with his US Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer, who sort of pioneered that deal. And what it did was it created a highly interdependent North American supply chain for things like autos, right? So for Ford or GM to produce automobiles in the United States, they're sometimes relying on goods that are coming back and forth between the US and Mexico multiple times. If you put those tariffs on for Mexico and Canada, it's actually going to benefit companies like Honda, who are making their cars in Korea with no US content, over an American car manufacturer who needs to buy inputs that are going into their vehicles from Mexico or Canada.
Okay, so if you had to steel man Trump, do you just see him, he's a loose cannon, he doesn't know what he's doing, he wants to slap people around, or is there at least something internally consistent to Trump where you're like, he's wrong, it's not going to have the effect that he wants, but at least I understand what he thinks?
Look, I think that Trump clearly likes using economic warfare. He loves tariffs. He said it's the most beautiful word in the English language.
He downgraded it to fourth.
Oh, really?
After people gave him so much love, God, religion, maybe, I think are the first three.
Having served in government, I understand the appeal of sanctions and tariffs. For one, they're very easy to impose. If you go back to the 1990s, for instance, when the U.S. had an embargo against Iraq, this is when Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait in 1990. To actually do effective sanctions on Iraq back then, you needed 13 years of U.S. Navy ships patrolling the Persian Gulf 24/7 to ensure that oil wasn't going out of Iraqi ports, right? So that was a pretty burdensome type of an operation. What happened is, in the wake of hyperglobalization in the 1990s, when you start getting these deeply integrated financial markets and supply chains, today, President Trump can sign a document in the Oval Office and just with that signature impose economic harm on another country, orders of magnitude more than that 1990s embargo, just by weaponizing these choke points like the US dollar financial system, like semiconductor supply chains, like oil supply chains. So I think that there's a temptation to use these tools because they're powerful and they're very easy to use. It just takes a presidential signature. And so I understand why he likes using them. I think the other thing, and this is just so far kind of reading between the lines of his first month back in the White House, is it seems like Trump is a little bit more comfortable using these tools against countries who may not be able to retaliate aggressively against the United States. What you haven't seen as much of is really, really aggressive measures against Russia or China. And so it could be that Trump is sizing up the situation and thinking, well, what's Canada going to do, right? They're totally dependent on us. And so we could wield this cudgel over the Canadian government, and they frankly just don't have an alternative.
Well, one of my favorite quotes about history is that the only constant in history is the law of unintended consequences. What do you think the unintended consequences are going to be here?
Yeah. So I think in the short run, the type of unintended consequences you'll see are higher prices, right? And I think this is the thing that might lead Trump to eventually backtrack from some of these tariffs, because I think a big reason he was elected was to bring down things like the price of eggs, right? I think a lot of the things we're buying from Canada and Mexico are basic goods, right? Mexico is providing a lot of the fruits and vegetables that Americans eat in the wintertime because it's warmer there than it is here. Canada is providing, millions of barrels of oil a day to the United States. So I think it could wind up worsening inflation. I think it also could wind up hurting American manufacturers. And I think this is arguably the reason that Trump would move away faster. And just going back to this car example, right? The autos that are produced in the US are not 100% US content, right? Most of the inputs that are going into them, whether it's the brakes or the windshield, might be coming from Canada or Mexico. So the costs for manufacturers in the US are going to go up. And if there's a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, but a 0% tariff on South Korea or Japan, or Germany for that matter, BMW or Honda or Toyota, who are making vehicles outside of the United States, not using content from Mexico and Canada, are actually going to have a benefit over US made cars. So to me, this is the biggest unintended consequence, which is you actually might wind up hurting domestic manufacturing if you tariff Canada and Mexico in particular.
A company like Ford, so many of their parts are touching something in Canada that they're going to end up raising the costs on those elements, which ends up hurting them. But if I'm Trump and I'm trying to incentivize people to manufacture everything in the US. So, hey, you're doing the windshield up in Canada, but I want you to stop. I want you to start doing it in America.
Yeah.
Feels like he knows in the short term, there's going to be the raising of prices, but in the long term, it's going to push people to come here to America to do their manufacturing. That's going to create a lot of jobs. And if he can create the jobs faster than prices rise, or prices are going to temporarily rise, he's going to blame Canada and say, all they had to do was solve the fentanyl crisis. If they had dealt with that, no one's going to understand how much you're talking about. He's going to have a spin story for that anyway. If they had just addressed that seriously, if we had a serious partner or they became the 51st state, we'd be fine. There'd be no problem. And by the way, you can buy, there's all these other cars coming in from all these great manufacturers and they're doing fine. And in the long run, trust me, your manufacturers are going to bring everything home here. It's going to be better for you. Given that he isn't applying it to Japan, where we get a ton of cars, he's not applying it to South Korea, he's not applying it to Germany, won't the prices go up on certain things, but migrate over to others, which buys him time to force people's hand to bring manufacturing home to the US?
Look, in an ideal world, that would happen. I'm skeptical. And I think this is why you've seen things like even, unions for automakers come out against these tariffs, because car makers don't have that much time, right? I mean, how long would it actually take to build a fully indigenized supply chain for autos? It would probably take 5 to 10 years.
Elon Musk is doing it. Elon Musk pulled that stuff together a lot faster than that.
I don't think that the US car industry could survive that long. On the one hand, he talks about using tariffs for structural reasons, like bringing jobs back to America or raising revenue for the government, right? But then on the other hand, he talks about tariffs as a tool in negotiation, right? Where he could use tariffs and then trade them away in exchange for, Canada beefing up security at the US-Canada border, right? For the first thing to happen, for any structural change, like the investment to come into the US, you need tariffs to be permanent, right? Because any investment that's going to be made in the US in a new factory, you're not going to make that investment if you're going to say, oh, well, these tariffs could come off in 2 years and all of a sudden I'm going to be undercut on price by the Mexicans yet again, right? Whoever building that factory has to have assurance that these tariffs are going to stay in place for at least as long as it takes for that factory to get set up, to start making their product and to start selling their product. So it's a long proposition, right? But then if you're just using these as sort of cards to play at a table, that's not going to then, you're going to keep, basically the US investors are going to wait till the very last minute to actually start onshoring their supply chains, right? And so I think that ultimately, and look, this is normal for any US administration, there are always different factions who want policies for different reasons. There are definitely people in the current Trump administration who see tariffs as something that are just good and they should be in place forever and we should never trade them away. That is like the pro-tariff faction, right? But then there are other people in the administration who see tariffs as a tool that Trump can use as a deal maker. And frankly, I think that is personally where Trump stands. Like, I think Trump sees himself above all as someone who loves making deals.
He's definitely beat that drum to death.
Yes. Yeah. And so even with the Chinese, right, you'd be surprised at what he'd be willing to give up in exchange for a big trade deal with Xi Jinping. And in fact, he was prepared to do that during his first term. He got a phase 1 trade deal with the Chinese in January of 2020, and then that quickly unraveled after COVID started.
What did that look like? Like, what was going to be the give and take?
The Chinese were promising to buy a bunch of stuff from the United States. What Trump doesn't like about the US-Chinese trade relationship is the deficit, right? We import a whole lot more from China than China imports from us.
Right.
And so there are 2 ways that you could really address that, right? One would be we buy less from China. And that's probably the most practical way to actually close the deficit. What Trump wanted, which makes sense because he's a businessman, he wanted China to buy more stuff from us. And so the Chinese were promising to buy large amounts of agricultural products from the United States, like soybeans and whatnot. Most studies that have shown sort of how China behaved since the phase 1 trade deal show that China did not live up to its commitments. They did not buy the goods that they said they would.
Interesting. So did that play out during the Trump term, or that was all after Biden comes into office, COVID's in full swing, and they're like, oh, disruption, can't do it. Sorry. Was it something like that?
So this deal was signed in January 2020. I think even as during 2020, they weren't living up to their commitments. The US-China relationship collapsed in 2020 because I think Trump believed that Xi Jinping lied to him about COVID, which I think is true. He did lie to him about COVID.
Xi Jinping lied to everybody.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So, and I think Trump rightfully thought that that was what undercut his presidency. And so China never lived up to its phase one trade deal commitments. And Robert Lighthizer, who's the U.S. trade representative during the first term, who was really the architect of Trump's China tariffs and the phase one deal, as well as the architect of the USMCA, which is the U.S., Canada, Mexico agreement. I spoke to him at length when I was researching and writing choke points. And I think for good reason. He's very proud of USMCA, of the U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement, and not quite as proud of the China phase one trade deal.
Yeah. I want to quote something you said in the book. In the years to come, fighting and winning economic wars will only get harder, especially as China and other countries strengthen both their offensive capabilities and their defensive fortifications. And the U.S. is not going to be able to be a one-way bully. And China has spent a long time with a lot of different initiatives, not the least of which is the Belt and Road Initiative, building a bunch of allies, building a smaller reliance on the American economy, becoming more self-sufficient. If I'm Trump and I'm looking at that trade imbalance, and I know that there's a potential hot war that needs to be avoided, how does he play that game well? So he just doubled the tariffs. They're now at 20%. If he has a partner in Xi Jinping who he can't trust, is this going to work? Does this fall flat? Like, where do we go from here?
Yeah, look, I'm glad that you picked that out, because I think there's a fundamental difference between the risks of an economic conflict with China today than during Trump's first term. I think one of the sort of biggest legacies of Trump's first term, and one of the stories that was most interesting for me to sort of retell in choke points, is how Trump really broke the taboo during his first term that China was too big to sanction. For decades, China had been waging economic war against the United States, and there had been very little reaction from U.S. presidents. And I think
they were afraid of China. Like, why not react?
So many U.S. companies were basically so heavily invested in China and so
from
dependent,
a supply chain perspective.
Exactly, and so dependent on, frankly, cheap Chinese labor to make profits. And those companies were so influential that there was just never a significant constituency to do anything against China. I also think China skillfully took advantage of the WTO rules, basically where they joined the World Trade Organization. The U.S. helped them join the World Trade Organization right after the turn of the 21st century. And what they did basically was they stayed within the very narrow letter of the law of the WTO, but broke the spirit of it over and over again, forcing U.S. companies to transfer intellectual property to them in order to operate in the Chinese market, manipulating their currency, which of course, this is something that is a little confusing. If you're artificially devaluing your currency, you're basically making your exports more competitive than other countries, right? And so what China was doing was almost equivalent of putting a tariff on us. And that's what they did last time when Trump imposed tariffs on China. They devalued their currency. It sort of offsets the impact of the tariff, right? And what happened during the first Trump term is that China was surprised by all this. They were like, hold on a second, like U.S. presidents don't, impose sanctions on big Chinese companies. But Trump did this a number of times. He oftentimes was kind of walked back from sort of delivering a knockout blow to companies like ZTE and Huawei, because Xi Jinping was pretty skilled at flattering Trump and kind of persuading him not to deliver the coup de grace to some of these big Chinese companies. But ultimately, Trump changed the paradigm on U.S.-China relations, and Biden, in fact, built upon a lot of the China policies that Trump put in place. But I think what's different this time, Tom, is that, that trade and technology war that Trump started in 2018, that was 7 years ago, right? And so China's had a long time to prepare. And the way they've prepared is really in two different ways. They've insulated themselves by investing hundreds of billions of dollars in domestic self-sufficiency. This is a program called Made in China 2025, where they basically tried to decrease their vulnerability to these American-controlled choke points like the US dollar or semiconductor technology. But then they've also built out their own retaliatory capabilities. And I think this is the area that I'm a little concerned that Trump may not fully grasp, because I haven't heard him say anything to this effect. But he seems to think that in any trade war with China, we can win because we import so much more from them than they import from us that we can always impose more tariffs than they can, right? Because if we impose tariffs on all $500 billion of imports from China, they only have $150 billion of American imports that they can tariff, right? But what China can do now, because of the sort of retaliatory preparation, is they can retaliate asymmetrically. They can impose sanctions on individual US companies. And in fact, when Trump put his first 10% tariffs in place in early February, China retaliated not just with tariffs, they actually imposed sanctions on Illumina, which is a DNA sequencer company, as well as PVH, the American apparel company that owns Tommy Hilfiger. They put sanctions on Skydio, an American drone maker, the largest drone maker in the US, and it caused the company to ration batteries, where now their battlefield drones that the Ukrainians are using, they only have one battery per drone because of these sanctions. And so I think that's what you're going to get more of. And, even the antitrust investigations into NVIDIA and Google that China launched, I think that's direct retaliation, right? So they can pinpoint US companies and impose targeted pain on them. And of course, they can also restrict the sales of things like critical minerals to the US, which I think have been in the news lately for good reason, because it's an area that China has a complete dominant role in.
Yeah, we are very much going to have to talk about minerals and Russia and the madness that's going on there. But sticking with China for a minute. So a couple things on the table. You've got Apple making a $50 billion investment. So going back to they have to believe that something's going to be permanent. I have no idea what Trump said to Tim Cook that made him go, this is a good idea. Yeah. But that to me is a huge signal that Trump is saying something that is very compelling. Now, if they're going to just, shuffle and dance and hope that, they can make it to 4 years before they have to do anything, maybe that's what's at play there. But also in the book, you had another quote. The gist of it was that China and America are finally waking up to the reality that they are in a technological rivalry that is zero sum. And that the wild globalization of the 90s and the 2000s, like that has really come to an end. And now that these two really understand each other as pure competitors, if diplomacy fails, you move to economics. But if economics fails, you move to kinetic. We'll get back to the show in a moment, but first let's talk about the impossible choice that crypto investors are facing every day. You either keep your crypto in a secure retirement account with contribution limits and restrictions, or you trade freely on exchanges and run some risk that your assets all vanish. iTrust Capital's premium custody accounts finally eliminate this impossible choice. Premium custody accounts utilize a closed-loop system that prevents hackers from draining compromised accounts. Your assets are never leveraged, never loaned out, and never mixed with business operations. Unlike crypto IRAs, premium custody accounts have no annual contribution limits. You can buy and sell crypto 24/7 with complete freedom. Yes, transactions are taxable, but the unmatched security and control you get in return is worth it. Visit itrustcapital.com/impact and use code IMPACT when you sign up to fund your account to get a $100 bonus. Again, that's itrustcapital.com/impact and be sure to use code IMPACT. This is a paid advertisement, and now back to the show. And for the first time, it really feels like we're on this really shaky ground of diplomacy didn't get us very far. Certainly not if Trump feels lied to. Economic sanctions, they've hardened themselves against. And so the final chip on the table here is kinetic. How do you see, like when I read the Tim Cook move, I admit, I concede that maybe your Trump read is right and people are just going to try to buy time. But another reading of this would be that Tim Cook knows I can't even acknowledge Taiwan as like a separate entity. I have to be very careful what I say. That if anything, if China cut off manufacturing there for us as a company, we're in the most dangerous position ever. So they're diversifying now into India. They're diversifying theoretically now here in the US. Do you think that read is plausible? That people are realizing, okay, hold on, this is a zero-sum game, technologically charged, meaning it's happening at the tech level more than anything. And even our own manufacturers want the Trump song to be sung, which is why they were all at his inauguration, because they realize we need somebody to give us the economic incentive to onshore what you call friend shoring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think with respect to China, I fully agree. And that's, why I talk about the age of economic warfare, right? It's been clear, I think, to anyone who's paying attention that globalization's been dead for a while, right? I mean,
that's crazy, man. I'm really slow to wake up to that.
You can't unravel a full economic system overnight. But when I say it's dead, it's the belief that economic relations are win-win. You really have to you have to be wearing some real rose-tinted glasses to think that American economic relations with China or Russia are win-win, right? I mean, I think there have been zero-sum for quite some time, and certainly in specific sectors. I think with a country like Russia, they're in zero-sum in almost every sector. There may be a couple exceptions. So these tariffs, these sanctions, these export controls that the U.S. imposes, that China imposes, that the EU imposes, brick by brick, they're building a new world economy. That's what's happening. It's taking time, right? It's not overnight. It's not like 1944 when a bunch of world leaders went to the Bretton Woods conference in New Hampshire and negotiated the terms of the world economy. It's a different process, right? It's a more haphazard process that's happening over time.
It feels to me.
Exactly. And so I do think that companies, especially a company like Apple, where they're just incredibly dependent on China, it is within very smart move by Tim Cook to try to reduce Apple's exposure to China. It's hard for them to do just given the depth of it. I was happy to see this announcement. So I support decoupling from China, especially in critical areas that involve technology. I think it becomes much harder to actually decouple with China if you're also picking fights with our other big trading partners like Canada and Mexico, where they're not really national security threats. Economic relations with Canada, I think, are almost exclusively positive sum, right. Probably the same with Mexico. So, it becomes harder because at that point, you're picking trade fights with all three of our biggest trading partners, right? I'd rather see a strategy where Trump corrals other countries like the Canadians, like the Mexicans, like the Europeans into a block of democracies that can be stronger against sort of a Chinese-led bloc, right? And that's this concept of friendshoring. That was a word that Janet Yellen, who was the Treasury Secretary in the Biden administration, used. But even Lighthizer, who's sort of the architect of the Trump tariffs, he put out an op-ed recently where he made it was an op-ed in the New York Times that was explaining why tariffs are actually good. And I think he did this because there was kind of an onslaught of anti-tariff writing, both in the Times and in the Wall Street Journal. And Lighthizer was saying, no, actually, they're good. But the argument, if you read between the lines, was what we need is a block of democracies where we all have very low tariffs against each other, but then big tariffs on the dictatorships like the Chinas of the world.
Okay. As we go into the Russia of it all, one thing that I found really compelling about your book is in getting to look at the history of how this stuff came to be. I had the same sort of shock that I had when I realized that oil is a relatively recent phenomenon. Like oil is like the last 100 years. Mm-hmm. And reading about Churchill and realizing, there was like a moment where he was like, wait a second, our naval fleet could move a lot faster if we used oil instead of coal. And so he goes on this big pitch to get them to switch over to oil. And then you realize, wait a second, this is why they were trying to have relationships with the Middle East. This is all about economics, might. It wasn't a just sort of inevitable law of nature. I felt the same way about tariffs, that the playbook sort of happened and people realized, wait, this was really awkward and last minute. And it was like reactive instead of being proactive. But then a playbook started forming. And so now people know, with an executive order, I can stroke this and I can really do damage to another country and I can get them to heed. Given that playbook of things that have been put together relatively recently, what is happening right now with Russia? Because as somebody who didn't really understand the economic warfare of it all, it was like sort of dimly in the back of my mind, but I didn't really engage with it. Yeah. My initial reaction was, why would you weaponize the dollar? Like now you're just giving them every incentive to say, we want to be a part of BRICS. We want to get rid of the hegemony of the American dollar. We no longer want them to be the reserve currency. Other people like China started selling their US debt like crazy. And I'm still not sure what to make of the way that we have treated Russia confused even more now with what just happened recently, at least as of this recording, with Trump and Zelensky breaking down over the mineral rights, and then Putin coming in and saying, hey, I've got some minerals too. Look over here, baby. What do you make of all that? Is this Putin just trying to get out from under all those sanctions and get back in the financial good graces?
Yeah, look, I think just reading between the lines, and look, I've dealt with Russian officials for many years. Back when I was the Russia and Europe sanctions lead in the U.S. State Department, I myself have been sanctioned by Russia. When I hear Putin come out and saying, hey, check out our minerals, what that tells me as somebody who has spent a big part of my career negotiating deals with other countries, it's a sign of desperation, right? It's a sign that he needs something. He doesn't want the U.S. and Ukraine to sign this minerals deal because he realizes that his best chance at getting what he really wants, which is sort of a get out of jail free card where you lift sanctions on Russia, and even more than that, a rupture in the transatlantic relationship, basically breaking the U.S. and Europe right across the Atlantic Ocean and destroying NATO. His best way of doing that is by preventing this U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal, because he knows that Trump doesn't care about the appeals to alliances and liberal international order. These are things that when Trump hears it, he says, I could care less, right? But what he does care about is investment for U.S. companies, mineral resources for the U.S. economy. And of course, being less vulnerable to these choke points that China has over the U.S., like critical minerals, like graphite, like lithium. These are areas that China dominates that we could potentially have an even better and more reliable source from in Ukraine. So when I hear Putin basically trying to, stymie this deal at the last minute, I think he realizes that Zelensky actually has come up with potentially a wedge issue to get Trump back into the Ukrainian side. That, of course, I think has been called into significant jeopardy after the whole blow up in the Oval Office. And, it's hard for me to explain exactly what happened. If I, just sort of watching the tape and studying it, it does kind of seem like J.D. Vance was sort of picking a fight to a certain extent with Zelensky. And then I think Trump kind of came to Vance's aid sort of in that fight.
I had a very different take.
Oh, interesting. What was your thought?
Do you know Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power?
I'm familiar with it, but I haven't read it.
Okay. So law number one is never outshine the master. Zelensky needs something from Trump. So in this case, love him or hate him, he's the guy that you don't want to outshine. You've got all the cameras of the world on you. The tenor in the room changes when he turns to Vance and says, what diplomacy you're talking about. Like Russia has broken treaties over and over and over. And the thing is, I feel for the guy. Like he is on the front line, risking his own life, watching people who I will choose to believe, because people are going to say what they're going to say, but these are his countrymen dying on the front lines. And he's seen God knows how many mothers who have lost children, have the weight of having to send these young men into battle to die. And he's like, this guy will break this stuff all the time. I'm not going to give you mineral rights unless there's some security guarantees. We can talk about that in a minute. Then you've got Vance, who takes the emotional bait and is annoyed that this guy's not being thankful enough and gets put in a weird position where, in fairness, I think Zelensky had a killer question, though he never should have asked it. Not in that situation. You have a goal in mind. You were trying to get this war ended. You're sitting across from the guy that can make it happen, and you literally fumble the ball. Any one of them could have diffused the situation. None of them did. But I feel like if don't outshine the master, know who you're dealing with. It's like Law 22. And he was not thinking about what Trump and Vance are like. And so he totally misplayed that. He's got to, and another one of the laws, I forget the number, but is play the surrender card. Like know when to show your vulnerability, know when to roll over and show your belly, and let that person like trigger that desire for them to take care of you. And once I started looking at the moment through Robert Greene's lens of the 48 Laws of Power, which is basically Machiavelli, you're like, oh my God, Zelensky misplayed that moment. Because if he had, I mean, you even said like Xi knows how to play Trump and Zelensky doesn't. And if, again, I'm not saying I'm on Trump's side. I so wish he had been the bigger man and just gone, look, we're not going to talk about that right now. Guys, everybody clear the room. I need to talk to these two with the cameras off. And then fine, slap him around all you want. But the way that it all became theatrical, you've got JD Vance playing to the crowd because I think he realized he'd been backed into a corner and he didn't have a great argument, which never should have been brought up, but it was, and he didn't know what to do with it. So anyway, it just becomes this total clusterfuck. But I think Zelensky could have just come in, known, okay, I have to show my belly. I have to make them look like the hero. I've got to be grateful, on and on. And God, it would have been such a different play.
Yeah, well, Tom, I'm kind of surprised you've never done diplomacy because I thought that was a brilliant analysis, to be honest.
Shout out to Robert Greene.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that I understand. I mean, look, it's hard to put yourself in Zelensky's shoes, right? He's a wartime leader. His country's been invaded. And so I can imagine being triggered when you hear things like, no doubt, you provoked them or something,
Dude, that shit was crazy.
Yeah.
He was like, he did it, or he's a dictator and this is his fault. I forget the words that Trump used, forgive me, but the sentiment was god awful.
But I'm with you though. I think that, U.S. support for Ukraine is existential for Zelensky. And so if that means he has to come and show his belly to Trump, I think it's worth doing that. So I don't dispute what you're saying. I do wonder if JD Vance was also, like you said, sort of playing to the crowd or trying to show up, the MAGA folks that, he's just as badass as Trump is or something. Hard for me to say, but that was sort of how I interpret it, just because it's so rare. I mean, like I said, I've been doing this stuff for a while. I've never seen anything like that, right? The idea that you have like a public diplomatic spat in the Oval Office while the cameras are rolling. I mean,
do you love or hate that they did that on camera?
I hate it. I hate it.
I'm conflicted. I hate it, but I love it so much. I hate it because the cameras were what made it fall apart. Because privately, I think Trump could have, and I'm not saying this is good, I'm just saying it's what he would have done. He would have reestablished his dominance. He would have told him, don't tell me how we're going to feel. Don't tell me how we're going to feel. Like he would have shut it down and been like, you're out of your fucking mind. You need to thank me right now. Yeah. And Zelensky hopefully would have come to his senses and gone, even though I have to eat crow in this moment, and not saying I should have to, but I do have to, and would have done it because there's nobody watching. But everyone was playing to their base. The reason I love it is because we live in an age where for the first time, transparency is really possible. And it's a double-edged sword. It's not going to be all good, but wow, we can really see how this stuff is done now. Yeah. Yeah. No, and look, I think if that was all genuine and there wasn't any playing to the crowd, I'm with you. I do worry though, at least in the Vance side of the equation, there did feel like a theatrical all of them
element.
He was the one that felt theatrical. They were all aware of their base watching for sure.
Yes. And of course, and people forget this, like Zelensky is a democratic politician too. And it's hard for him as well in Ukraine to be seen to, sit in the Oval Office as comments are being made about his country's shared culpability in the war when anyone can see that they were invaded by their neighbor and not respond. But I'm with you. I think, at some point you gotta sort of, bite your tongue and do what it takes to get your country going. What I would say though, Tom, is, there's this narrative out there that I hear sometimes that, the sanctions on Russia haven't been that painful to Russia and everything's fine. And, if you go to Moscow, everyone's buying things in department stores and everyone's happy. I think what that tells you though is that it's more something just about like the limits of economic warfare, where like it's pretty hard to impoverish a billionaire oligarch, right? Like that's not actually something sanctions do. But if you look across Russian society and the Russian economy, it's in very, very bad shape right now. I mean, they've got interest rates at 21%.
Is this because of the sanctions?
Yeah. So you got a benchmark interest rate at 21%.
Whoa.
You can't get a home mortgage in Russia for anything below 30%.
Yo.
And so it's at the point now where if you're a Russian, the only rational thing to do with money is let it sit in your bank account. Like there's zero investment in that economy except for the government investment in military production, in weapons. And those weapons are just getting blown up on the battlefield in Ukraine, right? So they're not actually building anything, right? Like it's not investing in the productive capacity of the Russian economy. So I think what Putin sees and what, the one area of the Russian government that's still pretty technocratic, that still has experts, is the central bank. So the governor of the Central Bank of Russia is a character in my book named Elvira Nabiulina. She's been there for over a decade. I mean, if she lived in the US, she could be like the chair of the Fed. She's brilliant economist and well-respected around the world. She knows that Russia's economy is going nowhere fast. They project that they're going to have zero growth this year.
Oof.
And so, you study Kremlin statements long enough, that usually means, something like probably a significant recession as opposed to zero growth. I mean, the official inflation rate's 10%. So you got to imagine it's quite a bit higher than that.
Oh God, you just gave me the chills.
Yeah, right.
That's
so, I mean,
brutal.
So like you think what we've gone through in the US in the last few years is bad. I mean, things are really rough in Russia right now. And I think Putin sees this opportunity with Trump as like his one chance to get everything that he wants, which is he doesn't have to give up what he's taken in Ukraine, and he can get out from under the weight of sanctions. That's what he's trying to do. Whether or not Trump goes for it, I'm not so sure, because Trump obviously is always attracted to these ideas of business deals. And I think that's why the Russians are playing to that. But there really aren't business opportunities in Russia for the United States right now. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. I think the key sector of Russia's economy is the oil and gas sector, right? So if you were to remove all the sanctions on Russian oil and gas, what would it do? You'd have more Russian oil on the market and more Russian liquefied natural gas on the market. And what would that do to American companies? American LNG, the liquefied natural gas producers in the Gulf Coast, they've been making bank because Russian gas has stopped going to Europe, right? I mean, they've taken market share away from the Gazproms of the world. Gazprom's a big Russian gas giant. If Russian crude oil floods the market and you get lower prices, American shale producers can't make money at an oil price that's below $60 or $70 a barrel. So if you get much lower oil prices, you're going to wipe out the American shale industry. And so I'm skeptical that Trump will ultimately go for this. I understand why Putin wants it. I don't really understand from a dollars and cents perspective what's in it for the United States.
Okay, let me throw out a hypothesis here. Tell me if this is crazy. Okay, so I'm Trump. I'm looking at, I'm racing towards conflict with China on a technological front. I understand that the future of everything, warfare, AI, drones, all of it it's all tech, it's all chips, it's batteries and phones. It's the things that rare earth minerals are going to be necessary for. The US is distressingly low in rare earth minerals. My major players are going to be China and Russia / Ukraine. I go to Ukraine first because if I'm Trump, do I care about the moral high ground? I'm not sure, but certainly he knows how to read the public. And the public was on the side of Zelensky, I would say, until recently, where it's become a little bit shakier, a little bit less clear. Certainly the MAGA right is got some question marks, or some are, I think, swinging the other way. I'll finish that thought in a minute. So you've got this play where you have an opportunity to rebalance your reliance on China with at least somebody else. Maybe you can switch entirely, but you now have options. And when you're the art of the deal guy, you always want options. Leverage is when you can walk away. And if you can't walk away, which right now we can't walk away from China, you're really in a tough spot. So cool, I go to Zelensky. Public is going to like that better. He was aggressed on, plus everybody already thinks I'm a Putin puppet. So let me go to Zelensky. Goes to Zelensky, thinks he's got a deal. And theoretically, if they can be believed, that multiple times Zelensky has said, we've got a deal, only to then balk. Now, given what was said publicly in that meeting, I have a feeling Zelensky has been very clear and Trump has been very clear, but neither of them understand each other. And what's being said is Trump is saying, I'm not going to do security guarantees while you're at war. That's crazy. I'm not going to promise that America will come to you. They're actively shooting at your people right now. What kind of security guarantee can I give you? So I'm going to intertwine our economies. I now care about what happens to your mineral rights. So I'm going to leverage as an economic warrior. I'm going to engage in economic warfare against Russia, the likes of which they've never seen. This is me trying to channel Trump. And Zelensky's saying, bro, this guy has broken treaties multiple times. That means nothing to me. If you can get him to do a ceasefire, what am I supposed to do with that? He's going to just disregard it. So what I need, I will happily share in these mineral rights with you because it's existential for my country. But I need you to sign on that dotted line. And so they just keep missing each other, where you've got Zelensky who doesn't believe, I would say at a minimum, or let's all remember, Zelensky has a right wing as well. And so they're not going to love him coming back and being like, no. Trump said that he'll care now about our country's sovereignty because of the mineral rights. Well, did you get it in writing? No, well, he was a little weird about that.
Promised.
Yeah, right. So I think they'll be super sketched. So he's like, wait, I've got to get this in writing. Like, you don't understand. And Trump is like, it's a non-starter.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing that I find hard to reconcile is the part of me that, despite understanding realpolitik, hates realpolitik because it's so amoral. And so here we've got, I'm setting aside the NATO pushed up against his border, which if you have a take on that, I'll definitely like to hear that.
Yeah.
But you've got you've got Putin, who's like, you guys have pushed NATO right up to my doorstep, and this I will not abide. And so we're going to reclaim what he sees as his rightful territory anyway. We're going to reclaim that. But you've got a dictator who poisons his enemies, going into a sovereign nation, invading it, killing God knows how many people. And we're all like ignoring that all of a sudden. Not everybody, but like it's suddenly like receding into the background of the conversation. And I'm like, whoa, wait a second. Like the reason we don't negotiate mineral rights with him is the same reason that we don't negotiate oil prices with Iran. Like what's happening
100%.
right now?
Yes.
So I don't know how to reconcile those two impulses in my own mind.
But here's the thing that worries me, Tom, is what you're saying is a sign of Putin's efforts working, right? Where it's like he's changed the conversation. Like you got to wonder like who's driving the conversation. Like because the conversation was all about like you wouldn't even be thinking about business deals with Russia as a conversation that was separate and apart from an end game to the war in Ukraine, right? The sanctions, the idea was you lift them if there's a peace that is tolerable, that, you know, it's part of it. That's your carrot. You know, that's what you get to play, the card you play at the negotiating table. You say, okay, Putin, you know, if you pull back from this part of Ukraine and there's peace for this number of days, then we start lifting sanctions, right? Putin has kind of reframed the conversation where the US and Russia are just talking bilaterally without really even considering the Ukraine situation. And your point about, you know, Russia as an adversary and like, this is like, why are we not negotiating oil deals with Iran? I think is really well said. And I think like, you know, I'll even say it just my own personal experience. You know, I came at this as being a Russophile. You know, I studied Russian history, Russian literature. I loved Russian culture. I lived in Russia for a summer when I was a student. You know, it's hard not to, you know, if you work on Russia issues, not to see the allure of a U.S.-Russia alliance, right? And in fact, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were wartime allies during the Second World War. The problem, though, is every single post-Cold War president has tried this. You know, Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin were best friends. You know, George W. Bush said that he looked in Putin's eyes and saw his soul. You know, Obama, I think one of the most catastrophic decisions he made was he became president 6 months after Putin had invaded Georgia in the summer of 2008. And then he said he was going to reset U.S.-Russian relations. So he basically gave Putin, basically just forgave the fact that he had just invaded his neighbor and effectively peeled off part of its territory in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which are these two breakaway regions in Georgia. And then Trump again, when he came in 2017, basically tried to excuse a bunch of the things that Russia had done. Biden, you know, I think was probably the most hawkish post-Cold War American president on Russia. But when he came in, what did he want? He wanted a stable and predictable relationship with Putin. And the reason he wanted that was because he said he saw the world the way you and I do, which is we need to focus on China, right? The problem is, you know, presidents don't get to just dictate the way other people act, right? And he might want a stable and predictable relationship, but what Putin wants is to rebuild the Russian empire. Yeah. And so within, you know, a few months of Biden coming into the White House, you have 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border. And so, you know, at some point you got to ask yourself, like, are you willing to live with an imperialist Russia, right? With a Russia that's on the march, that's conquering neighboring territories, not just Ukraine, but then also NATO members like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. Is that something we're okay with? Is that something that is, you know, something we can live with in the United States and would be comfortable in that world? My own view is no, that we can't be comfortable in that world. And in fact, would be opening Pandora's box, because as soon as you allow that to happen, what's stopping China from taking Taiwan or going even further, right? And taking other territories in its neighborhood, right? You basically you undo the biggest accomplishment of the 20th century after the catastrophe of World War II, which is to create a norm against the territorial conquest by force, right? That's how most of history was, right? Most of history was you're a strong country, you just took your neighbor's territory with your army, right? It's a pretty big accomplishment in human history that we don't really do that anymore, right?
Or didn't.
And so I do think that it's pretty important to push back against Russian aggression.
Okay. Push back against Russian aggression by re-teaming up with EU and funding the life out of the Ukraine?
So the short answer is yes, but I think there's something that we should talk about because it's not getting enough play right now, but it's really important, right? So over the last 3 years, the U.S. has given somewhere between $100 and $150 billion worth of support to Ukraine. The EU has given a similar amount, right around $150 billion to Ukraine. Currently, as we speak, there are $250 billion roughly of Russian sovereign assets sitting frozen in European bank accounts. They're just sitting there, accumulating interest. They're never going back to Russia. Why the hell has the European Union not seized these assets and given them to Ukraine? The US Congress last year, in overwhelming bipartisan majority, passed a law authorizing President Biden to seize the Russian assets in the United States and give them to Ukraine. In the US, there's only like 5 to 10 billion, so it's not that much, right? But in Europe, there's somewhere between 2 and 300 billion. So more than the total amount of US support to Ukraine over the last 3 years is just sitting there in European bank accounts. So I think the obvious solution here, Tom, is for the EU to seize those Russian assets, use them to buy weapons from US companies. So it's good for the US. It revitalizes the defense industrial base in the US, which has gone into disrepair in recent decades. And you give Ukraine stable economic and military support without burdening the US taxpayer at all. The reason I love this is it's good. The Democrats will love this because they want Ukraine to be on stable footing. And the MAGA people should love it too, because Europe is shouldering the burden. They're taking these assets. And it's good for American defense companies, right? This is money that it's not like the Europeans are going to give that to European companies to buy weapons for Ukraine. The best weapons are made by US companies. And the reason I think this is a great idea isn't so much that, Ukraine fights on forever, right? What you do is you change the dynamic on the battlefield. So Putin knows that Ukraine could fight on if it needs to for 5 to 10 more years. And we just got over talking about, 10, 15 minutes ago, that Russia's economy is in a really bad place. And I think they only have 1 or 2 more years of runway before things really go off the rails. So I think just by that sort of incredible vote of confidence in the Ukrainians and saying, look, you're not going to wait them out, Putin. Sorry, you can't do that. I think then you really get Putin in the mind space for a real serious negotiation. Problem right now is I think Putin is still kind of sitting at the table saying, I have all the cards. I can get whatever the hell I want. Shouldn't be that way. The US, Europe, and Ukraine on one side of the table versus Russia, you have a coalition that could get a very good deal out of Putin.
It begs the question then, why isn't Trump pursuing that?
It's a good question. I don't know because, I think Trump has effectively shocked the Europeans out of their slumber and they're now taking seriously things like putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, right? You have the British and French saying that they're willing to commit soldiers to a potential peacekeeping force.
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, which is huge, right? I mean, and not only is that great for Ukraine, but that's exactly what Trump has wanted. Like he wants the Europeans to step up and do more militarily, right? In terms of why he hasn't been pushing them to seize Russian assets, I don't know. And it's possible that some of this is happening behind closed doors. We don't know yet. I haven't heard a public argument in favor of it. And frankly, Biden should have pushed harder for it himself. I don't think Biden could have gotten it done because, the Europeans probably viewed Biden as too much of a partner that, they figured they couldn't listen to, they could ignore him if they wanted to. But I think if Trump went to the Europeans and said, look, the price of me continuing to stand with you guys was you taking these Russian assets, unburdening the American taxpayer from this issue, I think the Europeans would do it.
That's really interesting. Okay, so let me try to do the internet's favorite thing and mind read Trump. Don't they ever love that?
You might be able to do it.
Let's see. He has made public statements that basically if he can't get the deal done, he's going to let them fight it out. he's obviously made very public statements that this is a European problem and they need to be dealing with it. But if I'm Trump and I wanted to make sure that Putin understood that Zelensky was a credible threat, I don't know why he didn't really push that agenda. Oh man. If I think like a writer and I say Trump wanted to get the credit himself, that's why he wouldn't try to make this a European thing. Like, hey guys, you have all those assets, you should freeze them, give them to Ukraine. Part of it might be the messaging of, I just want the war to end. Because if you take Trump seriously and say, okay, this is somebody who just wants to see the killing stop, I can't reconcile two things. I believe him when he says he wants the killing to stop. And at the same time, if you want Ukraine to be strong so that you force Putin to the table, you would encourage Europe to get ready. Like, hey boys, we've got the checkbook open. We're ready to go. This is where I wish we had chat with us live. I'd love to see if anybody has like a different take on that. But the way that I reconcile that is he wants it to have been him that made the deal. He doesn't want to empower Europe to go make that deal and leave America on the outside. He wants to control the negotiations, and that means promising Zelensky in his own unique way that, no, trust me, if we intertwine our desire for the mineral rights, like if we're together on that, then I'm going to do some unsaid thing. At least he hasn't said it publicly to keep you protected. But yeah, at least live here in real time, I can't come up with an argument as to why you wouldn't, other than that, why you wouldn't want Europe to be in the driver's seat. We'll get back to the show in a moment, but first, let's talk about the most valuable asset of any entrepreneur: time. Your brilliant idea is worthless if you can't get it to market fast. This is exactly why Shopify has become the backbone of over 1 million businesses. They've solved the speed to market problem once and for all. With Shopify, you can launch in days, not months. Their system is built for velocity with the planet's most powerful checkout experience that turns browsers into buyers. Shop Pay boosts conversions by up to 50% because it eliminates friction at the exact moment customers decide to purchase. The market doesn't reward perfection, it rewards presence. Being available where your customers are shopping on Instagram, TikTok, in physical stores matters now more than ever. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout the top brands use. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/impact, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/impact to upgrade your selling today. And now let's get back to the show.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that Trump is very interested in the Nobel Peace Prize. I think that's actually it's hard to read Trump's mind, but this is one thing that, he's talked about enough times that you realize it's kind of one of the few things in life that he hasn't yet accomplished that he would love to have. So I'm with you. But I think that the Europeans aren't going to do this without Trump pushing them to do it. So I think he still winds up getting the credit.
Why? Why wouldn't they? If the assets are frozen, do they plan to take them and just fund healthcare? Or?
Yeah, right. Just use them as like a pillow or something. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the Germans in particular have been wary of this. And the reason is that they worry that it would undermine financial stability in the EU, that basically no one would trust the European financial system, and the euro would be seen as, an unsafe currency to be in.
And they don't think that's already happened just by the freezing.
They don't, but I'm with you. I find it to be a little confusing. What I will say, though, is you're about to have a political shift in Germany, right? This was under the previous chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who was a wet blanket, frankly, a very, very weak chancellor, right? The new guy is coming in, Friedrich Merz, seems much tougher. And so we'll see. I mean, German politics are complicated. And so I think, we're not exactly sure where things are going to head, but it's very possible that the German position could change. I think generally speaking, though, look, every American president in recent history has wanted the Europeans to do more, right? They wanted the Europeans to do more in terms of, helping Greece get out of the Eurozone crisis. They wanted the Europeans to do more in the fight against ISIS. They wanted the Europeans to do more with sanctions on Russia, right? It's always like pulling teeth. I used to negotiate with the Europeans too, right? Because the Europeans are afraid that Trump will actually cut the cord, right? That Trump may be willing to go where no US president has ever even contemplated, which is like abandoning NATO, right? Which I think would be very bad. So I hope he doesn't do that.
Because you think it would unleash Russian aggression or imperialism?
Exactly. Yes. Because they think that he might actually do that, they've kind of awoken from their slumber, right? So if this is some grand strategy that Trump is actually, he doesn't really want to get out of NATO, but he wants the Europeans to truly believe that he's willing to do it, it is working, right? I mean, the Europeans are getting much, much more serious about their own defense. I think that it's possible that the Europeans could come around to this issue of repurposing the Russian assets for Ukraine. And like I said, the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress has already passed a law. It is the law of the land that we can do this. We have the authority to do it in the U.S. The Canadian government has the authority to do it as well. The British government has the authority to do it. So I think you'd have the other big members of the G7, the other issuers of the world's reserve currencies like the pound and the Canadian dollar, ready to stand up and do this. The big question's been the Europeans because most of these assets are in euros. And the thing that's interesting, Tom, just like, and this is a story I recount in Choke Points actually, and it ties back to something you mentioned earlier about, is there a risk to weaponizing the dollar? Most countries hold the lion's share of their reserves in dollars, right? 60% of all reserves in the world are in dollars. That's why you call the dollar the world's reserve currency. The second place is the euro, which is about 20%, right? So the dollar's 3 times as frequently used in reserves than the euro. In 2018, Trump, in a series of a month, imposed really significant sanctions on a Chinese company called ZTE. He imposed sanctions on a Russian company called Rusal, which is the world's biggest aluminum maker. That was really catastrophic for that company. He wound up pulling it back, both that and the ZTE thing. And he wound up pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal and reimposing sanctions on Iran. This was all in April and May of 2018. And that was kind of when the world woke up to, whoa, like Trump is willing to like really take some serious risks in economic warfare, like shooting from the hip, doing things that other presidents wouldn't consider. And what did the Central Bank of Russia do literally the next month? They took all their assets out of dollars and moved them into euros. And it's because they thought that, the U.S. may not be predictable when it came to economic warfare, but the Europeans would never go along and actually do this. And I think that's one of the sort of little known successes of the last administration, the Biden administration, was they actually got the Europeans on board for these sanctions against Russia. Because that's what Putin wasn't expecting, right? He thought that, maybe the U.S. would be crazy enough to sanction my central bank. But the Europeans, you kidding me? The euros? They're not going to do that. But they did. And as a result, Putin really wasn't expecting this act of economic warfare that they were hit with in February of 2022.
So how do countries like Russia, like Iran, how do they manage to survive when they've got such harsh sanctions?
It's a great question. Iran, it's hard, right? Because Iran is comprehensively sanctioned. Like there is very few, as an American, you can't do any business with Iran. We've got a full trade embargo, full financial embargo on Iran. So they're very comprehensively sanctioned. We also have what's called secondary sanctions on Iran. So for instance, if you are an oil trader who wants to buy a barrel of Iranian oil, you yourself are risking getting sanctioned by the US. So if you're a Swiss oil trader who buys Iranian oil, the US could sanction you, which means that you are then cut off from the dollar, which probably means that you're going bankrupt, right? So Iran, it's very hard. And the way that they basically manage to do business in the global economy is through an incredibly complex patchwork of, telephone relationships, right? And barter, trading, literally bartering, trading. We trade you a good, you trade us a good in return, and no currency ever exchanges hands. There's a great story I recount in my book, Choke Points, in the summer of 2022. The Russians seized a bunch of military equipment from the battlefield in Ukraine, American military equipment like drones and things like that. They then took that military equipment and put it on a plane to send it to Iran in exchange for about 500 million euros in cash that then came back on the plane back to Russia.
Whoa!
So that's how they trade, right? And because you can trade actual banknotes, right? You can't control that, but you can't make a wire transfer. For Russia, it's a little different because Russia is not comprehensively sanctioned, right? I mean, the sanctions on Russia are still, I would call them patchy. The financial sector is pretty significantly sanctioned, the defense sector. The oil and gas sector, Biden was pretty weak when it came to energy sanctions on Russia.
Wisely so, or was that a mistake?
I think it was the biggest mistake of his Russia policy.
Whoa.
Because what Biden basically tried to do was he tried to maximize economic pain on Russia without touching the number one sector of Russia's economy, which is oil and gas.
Because so many other countries were importing gas from them?
It's because inflation was at a 40-year high in 2022, and oil prices were over $100 a barrel.
Whoa.
And ultimately, the political advisors in the White House won out over the national security advisors. And they said, we can't do anything that's going to make inflation worse or that's going to make oil prices harder and hit Americans at the pump. So we just can't go there.
Yeah.
And I think, look, he was right that inflation was a bad problem. In fact, it's probably a big reason that Kamala Harris lost the 2024 presidential election. But I think what it did was it signaled weakness to Putin. And I think it allowed Putin to have much more runway for this war than he would have otherwise had. So I think Biden, if he could go back in time, probably should have done much more aggressive oil and gas sanctions right at the beginning in 2022. If he had done it right then, it would have shortened Putin's runway for the war. And by the time you have the 2024 election, the economy would have adjusted, right? You would have had things like more shale production in the U.S. taking advantage of the market signal of higher prices.
Literally just going to ask about that. So how much of the drill baby drill Trump mentality is going to help us inoculate ourselves or make it so that we can sanction them into oblivion if we so choose?
I think it will help, certainly. And one of the key aspects of why the Iran sanctions leading up to the nuclear deal in 2015 were so effective. And those are the most effective sanctions, most effective act of American economic warfare in modern times were the Iranian oil sanctions from 2012 to 2013, in which in an 18-month period, the U.S. takes off 60% of Iran's oil exports from global markets and locks up over $100 billion of Iran's oil money in frozen overseas escrow accounts.
Whoa.
The reason that the U.S. is able to do this is because at the time, shale is pumping out so much oil that it's replacing all of the Iranian oil that's coming off the market. If Trump is serious about American energy dominance, which is what he says, and he's really willing to just unleash U.S. oil and gas, it's not enough just to take down regulations and stuff. Investors in the U.S. need a price signal. They need to say, okay, we know we're going to drill this well, and we know we're going to be able to sell it for $80 a barrel or something like that, right? And so I think that were Trump to actually ramp up oil and gas sanctions on Russia, combined with the fact that he's being a bit more lax when it comes to regulations on the oil and gas sector, could be a killer combination. But so far, we haven't seen any evidence that he's willing to stick it to Putin. This is the thing that worries me, is that he seems very happy to apply pressure to Zelensky, but like the guy who we really need leverage over, who's Vladimir Putin, we haven't seen as much.
All right. Super risky, but what do you think causes that? Like, people want to believe that, I don't know, either Putin says flattering things, that Trump is somehow getting kickbacks, or I don't know what they think, but that he is very much on Team Putin. Do you think he's on Team Putin, or is this a dog who sees one potential enemy as weak and the other strong, and so I'm going to bite the weak one?
I do think Trump has a history of being more comfortable threatening small countries than big ones, right? Like he does not, the level of kind of respect and almost deference he shows to Putin and Xi Jinping, he does not show to Justin Trudeau and Volodymyr Zelensky. I don't know what that is, but I do think that's a trend, right? And it's not just Putin. It is also Xi Jinping, who seems to have quite a bit of leverage over Trump. In terms of Russia itself, I think there are a few things at play. One is that the Russians blatantly interfered in the 2016 US election. They clearly had a preference for Trump. This is an objective fact. Whether or not it helped him win, I think no one knows, right? He may have won, even if the Russians had done nothing in the 2016 election, Trump may still have won, right? But the fact that they did interfere in the election, that it was very clear that they did, and that Trump won, I think Trump always sort of worried that his initial electoral victory was seen as illegitimate in some way. So I think on that simple count, he was sort of always a little concerned about Russia.
Doesn't that want to make him tell Putin to fuck off? Like, you don't have anything to do with this. Like, I'm the big man on campus. Like that, I don't know. Look, I've never looked deeply into that. I know some people are going to take super exception to the Russia hoax thing.
Yeah.
That I don't know. But when I look at that, what do I think? My gut instinct is that Trump understands who is strong on the playground and who is weak. And it's so much more comfy to go after the weak person.
Yeah.
And especially if also Trump really does want to make America great again. And even if he only wants to believe that so he can end up on Mount Rushmore, like I don't need people to believe that he's doing it out of the goodness of his heart. But when you really think about what motivates a person, he wants to be remembered as a deal maker, as a peacemaker, as somebody who really re-galvanized America. Then all of a sudden it makes sense. Like if you know Xi's going to be important, you've got to keep him at bay. You know that Russia, at least, they're important on the world stage. They're nowhere near somebody like China, obviously, but they are certainly meaningful on the world stage. There might be something there with Europe in terms of he's sort of European. And so there's I think he's got enough beef with Europe that there might be something there. But anyway, that feels right to me that, okay, I know strategically who I need to not push so far that they become aggressively antagonistic towards America. I mean, if nothing else, Russia still has a whole lot of nukes.
Totally.
So wanting to actively piss off Russia, probably not. Pissing off Ukraine, probably not as big of a deal. Pissing off Canada, I'm definitely not worried about that. Pissing off Mexico, not super worried about that. And I've got America behind me on the anti-cartel stuff and the immigration stuff. So I don't know, all of those feel relatively politically wise. The only one that has this big question mark is certainly the Democrats despise his treatment of Putin. Mm-hmm. And so I'm always a little shocked that he's still somewhat soft on him because he has a perception problem, if nothing else.
Yeah, I agree. And in some ways the easiest way for him to silence critics would be to go out and do something really tough against Russia. Mm-hmm. And 2 days into his presidency, I think it was January 22nd. So not too long ago, though it feels like a lifetime ago, he put out this post on Truth Social saying that if Putin doesn't end the war, he's going to face incredibly high levels of tariffs and sanctions. And I think he signed off saying, Putin can do this the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better. And for Russia watchers like me, this really, raised my antenna because I said, I've never heard Trump say anything like this, right? I mean, you go back throughout his entire first term, he's never said anything even remotely threatening against Russia. But this was a very clear, almost an ultimatum that was delivered on Truth Social. We haven't seen anything really follow up from that. There's not been any action to back that up. So I don't know where that came from. But in some ways, Tom, I think if he were to do more of that, it would A, give the US a little bit more leverage over Russia, and B, silence some of those domestic critics who are saying, wait, why is he, so unwilling to criticize Putin?
Yeah.
I think the other thing though, and this is important, I think seems like he has some affinity for Putin and Russia. He clearly hates Zelensky, right? Yeah. And I think that he associates Zelensky with his first impeachment, right? Because it was all about a phone call that he had with Zelensky. Obviously, Zelensky wasn't the one who pushed for his impeachment or something, but he's associated with that. And I do think that there was some concern. Certainly, J.D. Vance has this concern. He said as much in the Oval Office that Zelensky actively wanted Kamala Harris to win the election. And so I think that Trump does not like Zelensky as a human being and probably has better feelings toward Putin. And we know that Trump is a very, kind of relationship-based guy, right? Like he thinks that, U.S.-China relations are really Trump-Xi relations,
Yeah, that's interesting.
And so I think that there's some element of that too.
Very interesting. All right. I'm deeply interested in cryptocurrency,
Yeah.
especially Bitcoin. How much does that, which strikes me as a largely youth-led movement, youthish, led movement to reimagine the financial system, how much does that erode economic warfare and make it impossible? Because if they have a totally separate system, are they going to be able to impose the kind of sanctions that they can now?
Yeah, really, really important question. So again, the choke points in the title of my book are these parts of the global economy in which one country has a dominant position and there's very little redundancy. So right now in finance, the dollar is the only game in town, right? I say in the book, trying to do business across borders without access to the dollar is like trying to travel without a passport. You can't do it, right? What I will say though, is that choke points are not immutable. They come and go. In fact, they're created by entrepreneurs. They're created by businesses who are building new products that beat the old guys. And then all of a sudden governments realize that, wait, I have this resource at my disposal. Do I think we're on the verge of a fundamental shift in the way payments happen in the United States? Yes, I do. I think that the current dollar-based payment system that we rely on for international trade, and even when two non-US countries, even when India and Saudi Arabia are trading with each other, they're using the dollar. It's going through a correspondent bank account on Wall Street, right? That process was built in the 70s, and it still takes days to clear international bank transfers. Using stablecoins or central bank digital currencies, this process could take seconds. It's a better process, right? I think that digital currencies, whether or not they're cryptocurrencies or state-backed digital currencies, will disrupt international payments in the next 5 to 10 years. What I will say, though, is that that doesn't necessarily mean that the US will have less power. If it's a digital dollar or a stable coin that's pegged to the dollar, or a US company that is putting out this digital payment system, the US government may have even more leverage to wage economic warfare because all of a sudden all these transactions are happening in bits and bytes that could be going through US servers that are, companies that need to comply with US law. And in fact, the single biggest sanctions enforcement case of the last few years was a $4 billion fine against Binance, the cryptocurrency company, in which the CEO also had jail time, right? It was a $4 billion fine. So clearly, the long arm of the US sanctions enforcement state applies to crypto. The thing I'm worried about is that it could be China that wins this race. And at least when it comes to state-backed digital currencies, the currency in the lead is the digital RMB. China launched a central bank digital currency about 4 years ago. The Fed has not done anything like this. And the digital RMB is by far and away the leader in this space. China has also created a platform called mBridge, where different central banks can use their own digital currencies to settle trade between each other. So that example I used before of Saudi Arabia and India trading with each other, if they're using mBridge, they don't have to go through a correspondent bank account in Wall Street. And that transaction could clear in a few seconds instead of a week. So I think it's time for the US to get in the game. We need to win the race for digital currencies for us to retain this leverage. And we actually have to take steps, in my view, to actively undermine these projects that China's putting forward. We shouldn't allow US banks to participate in China's alternative to SWIFT. There's a program that China has called CIPS or CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. That's an alternative to SWIFT, which is the financial messaging service that most banks use today. Right now, US banks can participate in this. I think that's pretty foolish. So I think the Trump administration, if they're smart, will both do what they can to ensure the US wins the race for the payment system of the future, and also take steps to prevent China from gaining ground.
Interesting. Now, I don't know enough about the digital RMB, but I assume it's a CBDC.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And are you saying the US should do one?
I think we should, yes.
Cue people going crazy in the feed. Okay, so I have a super negative outlook on CBDCs from a just control standpoint. Given the Biden administration's absolutely anti-crypto stance, debanking people, all of that, like that feels like some real 1984 shit.
Yeah.
So do you see a difference between that and a stable coin? Like, are they either one you're happy with, or you're like, no, it needs to be a CBDC?
Look, I think that if you had a stable coin that was actually as good as a dollar, right? And I think that so far it's hard to say because the volumes aren't big enough to really be tested, right? I think it would be just as good as a CBDC. So what I'm really saying is we need the US to win this race. I personally am a little skeptical that a privately organized stablecoin could compete or could be treated as the equivalent of a US dollar with the full backing of the US Federal Reserve. If it could, more power to whoever's able to do that. It would be historically unusual for that to work. And I worry that as we sort of sit here in the US debating whether or not we should have this, China's actively gaining ground with their own state-backed digital currency.
Don't you think that's like some evil empire stuff though, where they're like matching it up with all their desire for control and their social credit score? Like, it feels so dystopian.
It is dystopian, and that's why I think we need to defeat it, right? And I think you can't beat something with nothing.
China. Like, you can't do a more controlling CBDC.
No, but I'm not saying that. So you could build safeguards into our CBDC, right?
Tell me more. How do we build safeguards from?
Well, you shouldn't. I think the U.S. government shouldn't just be able to cut off American citizens from bank accounts. That's crazy.
That is.
Should we be able to bar foreigners from using our central bank digital currency? Of course, that is what sanctions are for, right? Why should we allow Iran to be using Tether to fund its nuclear program? That doesn't make any sense to me.
What do you think about? Now, this may create a choke point that I'm going to be uncomfortable with. But what do you think about? So, if a stablecoin is backed by, say, U.S. Treasuries, 1-to-1, does that meet the needs you're trying to get to, where we can stop foreign adversaries, but still not trip up a citizen? Or does that still just give them too much control where they can say, I don't even know how they would stop them from using debt, but presumably they could.
Well, this is a broader point. Like, I find it interesting, and this could be my own background. I'm one of the few people who I've worked in government and I've worked in tech. So I've seen both sides of the equation. And I find it interesting that some people are like, oh, it would be so terrifying for my whole life to be dependent on, the Federal Reserve, right? And they could, freeze my bank account, right? But they're totally fine with, Mark Zuckerberg potentially being able to freeze their bank account, and
because of something like Libra you're talking about?
Yeah. And actually Libra plays a role in my story. One of the things that's really fascinating about Libra is that Stuart Levy, who was actually brought in to be the CEO of Libra, which then became Diem, pioneered U.S. financial warfare. He's the one who created the Iran sanctions playbook.
That's interesting.
In the 2000s and 2010s.
For people that don't know what Libra is, please let them know.
So Libra was a Facebook-backed digital currency that was supposed to be basically something that could eventually be as good as the U.S. dollar. And the U.S. government actively undermined it. And I think Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary in the Biden administration, is the one who sort of put the nail in the coffin, where she told the Libra folks that she wasn't going to support it. And I think there was a lot of concern in Washington about the power that Facebook could have. And we're talking about, you mentioned, what would a stablecoin that was fully backed by U.S. Treasuries, would that be a serious competitor to the dollar? I think there are very few companies that have the balance sheets to actually do that credibly. Facebook was one of them, right? I mean, Meta, one of the the most valuable companies in the world, potentially could actually do this. And given their user base between all of their various apps, I think it was a real threat. The thing I think is actually a little bit tragic is, knowing Stuart Levy personally, he's literally the founding father of American sanctions policy. He is as patriotic as they come. He was appointed by George W. Bush in 2004, and he was kept on by Barack Obama in 2009. If he's running the thing, I wasn't particularly worried about it being used to fund Hamas or Hezbollah. In fact, quite the opposite. I think that was a good chance for the U.S. to actually have digital currency innovation that complied with our national security priorities. The thing I worry about now is some of these other stable coins that don't have anything like that level of seriousness and compliance at the top. They are being used, for very, very nefarious purposes. And that's why you see, you saw Binance get into the trouble that they got into because their platform was being used for all sorts of bad problems.
Yeah, crypto is one of those where I'm very glad that it exists from the ability to opt out of inflation. But I'm always shocked that governments allow it. It's one of those where I'm like, it's pretty powerful to be able to print money. I hate it. I am violently opposed to it, but I get why they want to do it.
Yeah. The thing that's interesting, and one of the another interesting sort of story I tell in Choke Points is, the way we got the current financial system we have today, where the dollar is just everywhere, right? I mean, you need it to operate in the global economy. It really came about in the 1970s with when Richard Nixon pulled the dollar off of the gold peg in 1971. It's called the Nixon shock, where he gave a speech basically saying, effective right now, the dollar is no longer convertible at $35 an ounce for gold. And that was the central pillar of the Bretton Woods system, the economy, the global economy built after World War II, right? A big reason that happened was this thing called the Eurodollar market. It's a very jargony word, but basically what it meant was in the 60s and into the 70s, European banks started issuing dollars that were not backed by the Federal Reserve because they're European banks. They're not regulated by the US government. It was effectively an illicit market. It was similar to crypto. And the US government could have easily shut it down, right? They could have told the London banks who were issuing dollars, these aren't dollars, what are you doing here? But we actually came to like it because it wound up being a way for us to plug the deficits that we were running up with the Vietnam War. And so over time, this sort of like illicit market, the Eurodollar market, gets the stamp of approval by the US government and becomes like the central infrastructure of the global financial system. So in some ways, I think there's an interesting parallel to what you're seeing with crypto today, where the private sector sort of creates this like, semi-illicit market that's like these like pirates, who are creating it. And then all of a sudden the US government says, wait, we're going to assert control over this thing and we're going to use it to our own purposes.
The whole idea behind Bitcoin is that they won't be able to do that. Now, the other stuff that I have less conviction on, but the idea with Bitcoin is that because they have broken free of the gold standard and now can print as much as they want, they're still stealing your buying power. They are taxing your buying power. I'll use a friendlier word. And Bitcoin was a response to that. Mm-hmm. So, man, if any one government is able to get enough of the network, I suppose it's possible, but it seems highly unlikely at this point. So fingers crossed, because that is, while I hate the idea of treating it like a life raft, you don't know me well enough to know how much my audience has heard me rail about inflation, money printing. I think it is a grand evil. Bitcoin, they call it the life raft. I hate that because the average person doesn't, one, it's too volatile still. And then two, the average person you're asking them to take a huge gamble on something that's only been around for, less than 2 decades. So I hate that people need a life raft, but at least there is one.
I'm with you, by the way, on inflation. I think in some ways, many Americans who are experiencing inflation for the first time really in the last few years, because we had been going through such a long period of price stability. But inflation is the kind of the rising tide that sinks all boats, right? It's bad for everyone. It's bad for the poorest. It's bad for the richest. And so,
but if you've got a mega yacht, that water can rise a lot farther before you feel it.
That is true. That's true. And so, look, I think that it's high time for us to take these issues seriously and worry about inflation, worry about just printing money willy-nilly, worry about fiscal discipline. I think the thing that is a tough pill to swallow, though, is the way for us to deal with these things is through increasing taxes, right? I mean, it's very challenging for me to see how the US government can stop being so dependent on debt without higher taxes. I mean, cutting spending, is obviously a good thing. I think that's warranted, and I
But
hope.
do you think higher taxes on the current amount of GDP, or you're saying increase GDP so that there's more tax revenue coming in?
You need both, right? I think the idea that you can grow the economy so quickly that you can lower taxes and raise more money is a fool's errand. It's something that I would love to happen, but it's like, when I was running for president of my 5th grade class and promised everyone more recess, it's not going to happen. You might get elected saying it, but it's, and this has been the story, I think, of a lot of presidencies in the last 30 or 40 years, where presidents come in saying that they're going to take, deficits seriously and debt seriously, and then they lower taxes and they just worsen the deficit. And, it was actually only in the 90s where the last time we had a balanced budget. So I think these things are important. I think it's important to cut spending. There's definitely some waste, fraud, and abuse in the U.S. government that I hope is cut. But if you look at the main spending categories of the U.S. government, it's defense, which I think, if anything, needs to grow given the geopolitical environment. It's healthcare, which we've got an aging society. There's nothing we can do about that. And we cover everyone who's 65 and above, I think, for good reason. And it's Social Security, right? All the other stuff is tiny relative to those 3 categories. Could you cut some spending? Yes. But the real thing you need to do is both grow the economy faster and not only raise taxes, but I think more importantly is simplify the tax code, right? I mean,
now you're singing my song.
Yeah, I think I don't know about you, but you, in some ways you're just like, I don't care if I'm taxed more, but just like make it easy. Like tell me that I'm just going to be taxed a clear percentage on what I make.
I'll be very, very honest. So because I live in California, I'm taxed at over 50%. So
I am too, by the way, in New York. It's terrible. It's
crazy
very, very
town.
painful.
So here's my take on that. If you tax the wealthy at 100%, you still don't solve your spending problem. Mm-hmm. So given that you can tax them literally at 100% and you don't solve the problem, you have a problem that needs a solution other than more tax. Mm-hmm. I don't know that lowering taxes is the right answer, but I will say that you're going to have to increase GDP and you're going to have to find a way to balance your budget. Given that, now, why do I say that? Because, as you said, the servicing the debt is rapidly, it just surpassed your military spending. It will surpass all of your entitlements. It will become a beast if we keep spending at the current rate that we're spending, deficit spending, by the 2040s, it's like, it is your biggest expense by like some grotesque margin.
Yep.
So it is a snowball that only gets bigger.
Agreed.
So it is not optional to get your spending in line. So you either have to do it by making more money. And again, you can tax the rich at 100%. It won't get you there. So for people that want to pull that lever, I get it, but it doesn't actually get you there. Also, the vast majority of humanity does not understand the difference between being a billionaire on paper and having $1 billion in your bank. It's phantom money. They would have to sell their shares in their company, which they may or may not be able to do. And as they start selling, it's going to drive the price down. This is a very complex issue that comes back to, as Milton Friedman said, there's no such thing as an unbalanced budget. If you're spending $6 trillion, they are taxing that money in the form of inflation if they're only getting in tax, whatever, 4.6. Mm-hmm. So, man, here's where I wouldn't mind being taxed more if the outcomes were awesome. Yep. And the outcomes are trash. And so I've lived in LA now for 30 years, more. And I'm just watching it move in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. And companies are fleeing. Dude, In-N-Out, the burger joint, is now moving to Nashville, I think.
Oh, no.
So, yeah. So it's like...
It's not California anymore now.
No. Dude, they are making mistakes of the most egregious kind, not recognizing the second and third order consequences of when you just try to tax and spend it with no sense of like, what is my outcome? Mm-hmm. People leave. They vote with their feet.
Yep. And we're seeing that happen. I'm with you. I think we need to demand the best government that we possibly can get, right? Because every single tax dollar we have. I'm worried about Doge, to be honest, because I think that what they're doing, and just to be clear, what they've done so far is they've given orders to fire all the probationary employees. So what is a probationary employee? It's somebody who's been in the U.S. government for less than 2 years. So it means that they don't yet have civil service protections. So you can just fire them, right? These are recent law school graduates, recent business school graduates, recent public policy school graduates. They're people who are willing to work 12 to 16-hour days. They don't have kids. They're extremely smart. They're hungry. It's basically like you're firing all of the highest potential, hardest working people and the cheapest employees. People are getting paid $60,000 a year, and sparing the actual fat cats, the people who've been there for 30 years, who may work 6-hour days, if that, and are making $150,000 a year or even $170,000 a year. So I think the indiscriminate aspect of it is problematic. And I can say this firsthand because I've worked in the government, and I know the people who work the hardest are actually young people, right? You go to Washington, you'll be surprised by how many 25 and 30-year-olds are doing really big things, because in order, there's the U.S. government, even compared to the biggest tech companies, there's no problem set like what the U.S. government has to deal with, right? There's a limitless amount of things to do. And so if you're a young person who's hungry, there's a lot of opportunity for you there. And so I worry about firing the highest potential, smartest people. And I've seen it even now. I mean, I teach a graduate at the graduate school at Columbia University. And I've been preaching to my students for years that, you could go make a ton of money on Wall Street. You could make a lot of money in Silicon Valley. And in fact, it's great. Go ahead and do that. But now, while you're young and hungry, go work in public service. Be patriotic, make your country better, deliver, national security wins for the American people. And I'm grateful to say that I have over a dozen of my students who are at places like the Treasury Department or State Department or Commerce Department, doing really important things, working on outcompeting China in tech, or working on, making the U.S. independent on foreign sources of energy and critical minerals. And these students of mine are worried that their jobs are at risk, and for no reason, not because of their performance, but just because, these are the only people that, Doge thinks they can fire because they've worked there for 2 years. So if you wanted to do a top to bottom personnel review in which you fired the least productive workers and you raised the standard, raised the bar for what you expect of a U.S. government employee, I'm all for it. We need the best and brightest in our government. But I think the way that it's been handled so far, I don't think is actually driving toward that goal.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it and see the greatest capital allocator, certainly of our time. You've somehow managed to get him for free in the government, who's done the largest, as far as I know, the largest corporate turnaround ever. And he's doing what he can. In terms of, if you've got some people that are protected and there's no way that you can fire them, well, obviously he's not going to focus on that because he's got to deliver results quickly. You have a political reality to face, which is you've got to get some wins under your belt fast. The thing that I'm drawn to, though, with Doge is just give me transparency. I want to see it all. I want to see where this is going. I want to see all the dumb stuff like the rate that people can retire is tied to the speed of the elevator in the mine shaft that they put the paperwork in. I still can't believe that's real. That's crazy. Yes. And so getting somebody in there and starting to pull this stuff into the light and publishing out on a website, these are all the things that we're doing. I think that's good. Some of it is probably just theatrical and isn't like the real substantive thing, but at least capitalizing on this moment where people really want change and going, cool, like we're going to mix this up. We're going to start forcing transparency. We're going to start holding people accountable. And then hopefully over time, to your point, I mean, you outlined this so well in the book, that you start doing these things in the beginning. They're like these awkward sanctions and they work a little bit, but they have this knock-on effect that you didn't realize would happen. And so now you address it and you begin hardening it over time. If we can over time start doing like you're saying, I mean, one thing Elon has said is pay government employees more, not less.
Of course.
Because there's a corrupt forcing function where they're living in Washington, D.C., one of the most expensive places in the world with a terrible school system. So they want to send their kids to private schools. So it's like, oh God, if I take this lobbyist money, and you get this system that deranges itself. So getting everything transparent, getting everybody to want the government to be audited, which I still can't believe people are pushing back on that. That kind of change, at least directionally, is going in the right place. I'm all in favor of transparency. I think that transparency is wonderful, and I encourage that. To pivot back to the books, I'm glad you brought this up. I think that there is actually something Doge could accomplish
when it comes to economic warfare and geopolitical competition. I had the good fortune during my time in government to do a tour of duty in the Pentagon, where I worked for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marty Dempsey, who's a 4-star Army general. And I was kind of the token civilian who got to work on his strategic planning team. And it was helpful because I got to see what the U.S. military and the Pentagon does when it comes to planning for the wars of tomorrow. When you think about something like a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, right? Actively, every year, they're not only coming up with different military options that could be used in such a scenario, they're rehearsing them. That's what a military exercise is. You're actually testing this out, right? You're literally going out there and, seeing what might go wrong. You're wargaming these things and you're updating your plans, right? Your troops are professionally recruited and trained over decades of their lives, right? This is why we have the most lethal fighting force in the world. When it comes to economic warfare, we are a patchwork, right? You've got the Treasury Department, you've got the Commerce Department, you've got the State Department, you've got different officials at the White House. Frankly, if you read my book, it's focused on individuals. It's focused on people like Stuart Levy, who pioneered different uses of financial sanctions, because it takes policy entrepreneurship to succeed in that kind of system, right? There's not a Pentagon for economic warfare. And as a result, I also am concerned that we're falling behind other countries. China does have a much more streamlined process for doing these things. Even Japan just recently created a cabinet minister for economic security, right? We have the Secretary of Defense, they have a minister for economic security, right? I think DOGE would be wise to think about not necessarily cutting money into economic warfare. If anything, we need more money for these things, but right-sizing how the US government does it, right? Like going back to the drawing board and say, if we really want to fight and win the economic wars of tomorrow against China, against Russia, how do we need to structure our government so that we're not playing games of telephone and arguing with each other all day, and what we're actually positioned to win? And I think that would be a very beneficial thing. And I would love to see DOGE and Elon Musk put their time and attention into that problem.
Economic warfare, man, is crazy. Where can people follow along with you?
Well, first of all, I would highly recommend that you read my new book, Choke Points.
I can vouch for it. It's fantastic.
Appreciate it. And the Wall Street Journal just called it one of the 10 best reviewed books of February, which
Let's go.
Was an honor. And if you do read it, please reach out to me. I'm available on X at Edward Fishman. So you can send me a note there. And I love hearing feedback. The book came out on Tuesday, February 25th, and I've already had over 100 messages from early readers asking me questions, making comments. I love that. The thing as an author, you sit in your office for several years writing, and the thing that's most satisfying is when a reader picks up your book, reads it, and it sparks a new idea. And sometimes it changes my own thinking. So please reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about it.
I love it. Awesome. Well, guys, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more. Trump has just come into office. Do we think, or I should say, do you think, as we may see this differently, do you think that Trump is somebody who has the elite view of like, hey, the right people are in power, let's make these